Welcome to Forward Thinking, taking a deep dive into some of the biggest challenges facing real estate and tech today. We meet some of the most inspiring minds in a bid to find sustainable solutions.
Welcome to the latest episode of Forward Thinking. Today we're delighted to have Sammy Pahal, who is Managing Director of UK PropTech Association. Sammy, fantastic to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So hopefully this will be a great conversation. I think today we're going to explore topics around psychology, your background in real estate, your experience in PropTech, and really the themes that underlie all of that. So it should be really interesting.
Oh yeah, I'm very excited to be here today talking to you about psychology in particular, which is definitely a passion of mine.
And a background. So you studied psychology at university, is that right?
I did, yes, yeah. So quite some time ago now, but it is definitely still a passion and something that I'm very much interested in and feel definitely applies to what I'm doing at UKPA and real estate and PropTech in general.
Hugely. So you're kind of applying the theory now in practice, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's definitely more that I've learned being in the working world as well.
Yeah.
Around organisational psychology and change management as well. So but there's definitely things that I've utilised now.
Yeah.
I think within UKPA, but also in some of the topics and things that we focus on in terms of the programme.
So are you able to talk us through, because you're one of the founding members of the UK PropTech Association, so how did you transition from psychology into real estate and PropTech? That's quite a transition. Yes,
good question. I think to be honest, sort of fell into what I'm doing now. So when I left university, I'm from Southampton, so I came out of university and just thought, okay, I need to start earning some money, young, wanted to do different things, and joined Ordnance Survey.
Okay, yeah.
Who are obviously national mapping agency, blue chip company, very well known in Southampton. So I started my career there and started working in the land and property team. Mm-hmm. So I was looking at how location data was being used by property developers, architects, engineers, all sorts, and working with the technology companies who at the time I didn't realise that they were actually, I guess, considered PropTech.
Yeah.
PropTech was still
that
a new
term only came around a few years ago, didn't it? So
I think it wasn't something really that was known back then when I first joined Ordnance Survey. But some of the companies actually that I know of now, I'm working with now, were partners to Ordnance Survey. Right. So I was working with them and they were very sort of early stage, just in the idea phase at the time, and then exploring how they could use that data. So I just sort of started working at OS. I was there for 5 years, left Ordnance Survey and was presented with this opportunity to join UK PropTech Association, which had just launched that year. So I joined a couple of months in, really, to head up memberships. And it was quite a change, going from a large company like OS, government owned as well.
Hugely established, and it's the kind of granddaddy of mapping in the UK, isn't it? So.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's safe to say mapping wasn't my passion.
Yeah.
But actually, the way that data is being used and the fast rate of technology is so much more interesting.
Yeah.
That said, I still work quite closely with Ordnance Survey as well. They're very much in the PropTech space. So we do partner with them now, which is quite funny because I'm still very much in touch with my old colleagues there. I joined UKPA and it was very different going from 1,000 employees, team of 13, to essentially working just with the founder of UKPA.
Yeah.
So quite a learning curve.
It'd be useful or interesting to kind of explore the change in mentality between the large organisation and that of UKPA, which is much more agile, much faster. It's a startup mentality essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that was probably one of the most challenging things to have to navigate, because working in a large company, and I suppose this is the same in real estate companies as well. They've been around for a very long time. There's ways to do things, it's much more difficult to try and drive change because you have more people to go through, processes in place, legacy systems as well. People have been at these organisations for a very long time. OS people had been there for up to 45 years. So that in itself means that change is quite slow. So when I joined UKPA, I kind of had to unlearn a lot of those things.
It's kind of changing the gear that you're working in, essentially, working at a much more rapid pace.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was no sort of processes in place at all. It was all just sort of having to figure things out like you would in any sort of startup, which is, I think, quite helpful in being able to relate to some of the PropTech members that we have, because you do have to just trial things. It's a completely different mentality.
Exactly, almost kind of laying the train track as you go. It's figuring it out, creating the process, creating the company, and just kind of feeding that growth, essentially. Yeah,
and I think learning from how you're doing things and looking at what's working well, what's not working well, really understanding your customers, because when you're in a big company, you're almost a little bit removed from that, even though you might think of yourselves as a customer-facing organisation. Really, when you're that large, you are removed unless you have a really good way of taking that feedback from customers and then being able to change things. Which is where what we've been able to do now at UKPA over the years.
That's also presumably hugely empowering, because you've gone from an organisation where you might see that they're doing the wrong thing or they could act in a better way, but you can't affect that organisational change. Whereas in a startup, you just have to kind of run with it, and you can take an idea and see that idea through from kind of conception to delivery, really rapidly.
Yeah, I think it's both scary, but also quite exciting, because you do have that flexibility and that autonomy to just try things and see what works. But you don't have the comfort of having a big team and a structure in place to be able to support you in that way.
Okay, so kind of walking the tight wire at the same time.
Yeah, definitely.
Nice. So you've almost seen it from both sides of the coin then. So change management is obviously a huge topic within the industry. Startups have great ideas, but they need to affect change management typically within those big organisations that you've worked in, like OS. So what tactics could they use, or what are the most effective ways that you've seen to actually affect that change?
So I think it's an interesting question, because I think whilst PropTechs have some role to play in affecting that change, the change has to come from within. I think large companies like that really have to focus on change management, as a real sort of process, and bring in the expertise that they need to manage that, because you can have all the will in the world to want to do something differently, but the processes and the people will prevent you from doing that. And often that can be unknown. I think if you just have to look at when you as a consumer or as a average person, you make New Year's resolutions, and within a few weeks they go out the window, and that's not because people don't want to change. It is just because those changes that they want to make are not necessarily aligned with people and processes. You really have to, if I want to cook more, then I need to make sure I leave the office at 5 p.m, because if I don't, then I'm going to go home and then just order a takeaway.
Yeah, exactly. It's the behavioural change that kind of underlies it, isn't it?
So you have to look at the whole process. You have to, relating it back to PropTech and real estate, you have to look at the processes in place that might actually be hindering that change, and uncover those barriers early on. And there's a term in sort of change management that's called hidden or unknown resistance, unintentional resistance, sorry. And that's where, you might have everybody, assuming you have everybody on board, from the senior managers and the directors who want to drive change, and and those that are actually going to be doing things differently, the employees. You actually then have to look at, well, what are the processes that are currently in place? Where might the blockers be? Because they may be on board with it, and they may really believe that it's a great change to make and that it will make their life easier, but that's not enough. As soon as you start to look at, we're going to take this away from you because you can automate that, fear starts to creep in. And that's where, that resistance comes from.
It's tricky one. Like in, I guess, tech adoption from our side, so basically kind of digitising properties, real estate, you have the tech adoption curve, and so you have your innovators, those that are kind of chomping at the bit and trying out all the latest new technologies as soon as they're available. You have the early adopters, who are those that are probably those kind of strategic thinkers that you're mentioning in those organisations, those that are looking further ahead, can kind of see the trends and the writing on the wall and kind of the guiding direction essentially that they need to take that organisation. But then you've got the early majority, and it's kind of jumping that gap. And how do you drive adoption from someone that's looking at it strategically to someone that is maybe a few levels down from that individual in an organisation and is charged with doing a job or certain outcomes, and this is just not on their radar? So I feel like we've tackled that to some degree by just focusing in very clearly on how this is relevant to that individual in that role, making it, I guess, showing ease of use, showing value about what that technology is actually going to deliver. There are elements of fear, but I think you kind of just need to work through with them to show them actually it's going to make their life easier if they adopt this stuff. It's not going to make them redundant, it's not going to kind of write them out of the process, it's just going to mean, frankly, that they can do less admin and actually focus on the people and the customers and what they're there to do as a person or a kind of stakeholder in that organisation.
Yeah, I think it is exactly that. I think it's really looking at who the users are and what drives them, what motivates them, because it will be different things for different groups of people, and even at an individual level it might be different as well. So understanding what those drivers are, and then the messaging and positioning around it, because no one wants to be told, you know, you're not doing your job very efficiently right now.
Exactly.
So, you know, if you use this, you can do your job a lot better. You know, people still want to feel that they are experts and that they are valued. And that, I don't think, you know, doesn't really change, you know, whether you're a big organisation or a small organisation. I was listening to a podcast this morning actually, and they were talking about how when KitchenAids, you know, really random topic, but KitchenAids were brought in, they were trying to sell them to, this is, you know, going to sound really sexist now, but women back then. And in the US it just didn't take off because they were not, the way that they were selling it was saying that, oh, we can just put this flour in and dried eggs and you just have to add water. And no one wanted to do that because they didn't want it to be that simple.
It's removing their identity in a way, their kind of their role,
Yeah, because you don't want to think, oh, well, I've made this cake and it was just really easy. You want to, you know, say that, oh, actually, it's because I knew how to do this and I knew how to do that, and I've got that skill and the expertise. If you take away completely their expertise and the skills that they think are important to their job, they'll resist it. And I think that's the same with in real estate. You know, you have to, if you're providing a tool, let's say, you know, you're providing all this data to an individual and it's going to make them, you know, make better informed decisions, there still needs to be this level of, oh, okay, but it's me that knows how to use that data and actually pick out the insights. If it's all just, well, you know, this will tell you the answer, that's not going to be helpful. It's just,
they still need a stake in it.
Yeah.
So I guess the earlier they can get buy-in to that process as well, rather than also having it imposed on them and just being told you're now using this tool. Actually kind of helping shape the solutions, using their expertise to actually kind of define what they're actually going to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where companies really need to get under the hood and really understand, you know, how the structure of the organisation, who's doing what processes are already in place, what systems are already being used, and take them along the journey. And I think the larger companies are definitely doing more of that now. You know, some of our property members have innovation councils and they have stakeholders from across the business that are feeding into it. It's not just, you know, necessarily one person, although it might be one person sort of leading it,
championing it
internally. For it. Yeah, but they have, I think there's an awareness now, a recognition that you have to get all, you know, people, stakeholders from across the business involved.
And those innovation councils, have they been formed out of kind of the fear of missing out to their competitors, that if they don't innovate that they're going to be left behind? Is it done for compliance? Like, what is driving innovation, do you think, within a larger organisation?
I think, I think mainly fear. I think most, you know, behaviour change is probably driven from fear, you know, some shape or form. So definitely that, you know, whether it is fear of, you know, your competition getting ahead, fear of disruption from the prop techs. You know, you'd have to look at the estate agents world to see that, you know, there are some companies that may be trying to do it just in a more innovative way and replace estate agents, and then others that are trying to help them. One interesting area I think is just raising awareness of what prop tech can do and how it can be implemented, because I think often there's a lot of talk around AI and the metaverse and all of these sort of buzzwords and things, but that is not necessarily then translated into the practicalities of what it means for people in their jobs now. It often is looked at, still as very much in the future, especially if it's not, something that is part of someone's core day job. So I think making it, simplifying prop tech and what it means for people is really important, and that's something that we focus on in our content and our events as well, is just sort of highlighting how technology is helping now and giving some real life case studies and demonstrating the ROI on that as well, because I think ultimately it always comes down to cost, doesn't it? I think it comes down to the bottom line.
Well, it comes down to cost, but it also comes down to what value is that end user receiving from the technology, and that's exactly what they should be focusing on. But making it real for them in their job and their role and what is important to them. And as you say, that is going to be different from user to user, but you need to do away with the buzzwords and do away with the kind of slightly theoretical strategy sometimes, and just zero in on exactly how is this going to help this person do this specific job and do that job more effectively. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that can happen once the business buys into it, and if that solution is aligned with the business objectives that have already been identified, and that's where there has to be that alignment from the top with those that are responsible for digital transformation and innovation, which sometimes there can be misalignment there. So if that piece has been done and then it's about the implementation, then it is definitely about the users and uncovering what those blockers might be, what the resistance might be. But there's also, I think, this piece around, before you get to that phase, when you're still sort of trying to navigate the prop tech landscape, I think that in itself is a really big challenge, and that, and psychology plays a part in that as well, because the prop tech industry is in terms of numbers, is still quite high. We have 10% of the global prop tech industry in the UK, and it's around sort of 700, 800 companies. And whilst we are sort of starting to see some consolidation happen, and acquisitions and collaborations more, I think there is still, it can be very overwhelming, and there's a lot of, I guess, noise and overchoice. Overchoice is a very real thing. As members of the public, as consumers, we find overchoice to be an issue all the time. Doesn't matter what it is, but when it comes to technology, I think that's a really big thing. People will tend to go for companies that they've heard of, which is where brand and marketing can play a really big role, but also means that, unfortunately, for some of the smaller companies that maybe don't have the resource to put into that, they can almost be sort of pushed aside. And I think there is some recognition now from companies that are saying, well, we don't want to just go for the companies that have the biggest marketing budgets, but you still can't get around the fact that actually, people buy from people that they know and like and are familiar with. And
it's the trust and expertise element. It's almost that social proof aspect of it as well.
Yeah. And it's also, part of it is unconscious. You have to, if you see a brand 7 times, it then starts to become memorable. So that's why, with what we're doing at UKPA, we do sort of try to give our members that brand promotion, just by sharing the content that they've got and sharing their successes. I think it's important to have that, brand out there, so that people will start to remember the name and remember what you do. But at the same time, then you have to back it up and make sure
with the actual practice and expertise. Exactly. So I mean, from the larger companies' perspective, I guess it is a risky exercise, isn't it? Especially with startups. Like, if they're moving away from the marketing kind of buzz, how do they know that this company can actually deliver what they hope it can deliver? So you just need that kind of proven track record, I guess. Maybe a few clients, examples, kind of champion sites, that kind of stuff, to just tout exactly what is possible.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where case studies come in. I also think that companies need to be set up in a slightly different way to be able to move more quickly and trial things. I think long gone are the days where you buy a system like IBM and then you're stuck with it for 10 years. You should be able to, try something, and if it doesn't quite work, move on to something else. Mm-hmm. I think we're still sort of, the infrastructure that these companies have is not quite there yet to be able to do that. You might be able to sort of, if you're looking at technology within buildings, I think that's slightly easier because you could probably just trial that product or that solution in a couple of buildings. Yeah. I think what's slightly more difficult is actually then the software that the companies are using, at a business level.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge cost to change, and so say a CRM is probably a bad example, but I mean, getting a company to adopt a system kind of organisation-wide, migrate their data in, educate everyone is a huge and costly exercise.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can see that. So you've worked with a number of startups now at UKPA. What advice would you give them in how to kind of approach change management with a large organisation?
Good question. I think it's just understanding, where they fit in. Mm-hmm. So, I think they really need to do their homework and make sure that they fully understand how these businesses are set up, what their key priorities are. I think, a lot of the time, especially the larger companies, are quite open about sharing where their key priority areas are. Most of the property companies that we have in our membership have got, 5 to 10 things that they're looking at. So I think the advice I would give is to look at how do you actually address some of those problem statements that these companies have identified? Mm-hmm. What is the return on investment? And how quickly can you achieve that return on investment as well? And how would you go about implementing the technology? How challenging or easy is it to implement? And obviously part of that is then understanding, well, what are some of those barriers? Because from a technical perspective, it might be quite easy, but from a people perspective, it might not be so easy.
It's always the people that are the sticking point.
Yeah, and I think lastly, I would say they just need to make sure that they're not going in and pitching something and telling people that they're doing a rubbish job.
Right, okay, going back to inadvertently offending the people that is actually going to be using the technology.
Yeah, exactly. And don't always go for the larger customers. I think it's better to have lots of small or medium-sized customers and really start to understand how your product is being used, get it right, and then you can go after some of the larger companies.
Definitely. I guess by doing that as well, you get a wider input into your product development. So rather than just having one behemoth company that is going to be dictating how you operate and the direction you go, you get wide input from the market essentially, and you can kind of use that to make a call about your strategy and future direction of the product.
Yeah. I know you're interviewing me, but how do Locale do that?
So I guess we're very fortunate that we've grown to a point where we have a lot of fantastic customers. So we're on the system at the moment, we have over 1,000 buildings. There are hundreds of thousands of users of the system. So product development is always a constant consideration, because you can't build something and then assume it's finished. A project might be finished, but a product is ongoing. You always need to be evolving it, you always need to be improving it and driving it forward in line with how people are actually using it. So we typically kind of monitor usage data from the product. So we've got a number of different products and we see how people actually behave. Are they effectively doing their job with it? Is there a way that we could improve that and make it quicker for them to use? We do regular kind of customer interviews. We understand what they like, what they don't like, other challenges they have in their job, and just kind of, it's almost like mini therapy sessions, like what do you like about your job, what don't you like, and from that you can kind of understand the jobs to be done essentially, what are they responsible for, what do they do on a daily basis, and we can, given our kind of background and expertise, you start to understand whether technology can make that more effective for them. And this is across the board, so we have different stakeholders from, I guess on the ground, from building operational level, you would have your front of house team or your security team or your building manager who are running the day-to-day operations, and then you've got your asset manager and your regional managers, your landlords, and so each of these stakeholders have slightly different needs, different pressures, I guess. So it's making sure that our system kind of spans quite a few different stakeholders, and I think sometimes that's where we find organisational change a bit of a challenge, because the guy on the ground might love it and this is going to make his job really easy to do, and why wouldn't you have a tech system to operate your building? But then it gets caught up with an asset manager or regional manager and it's got to fit into their tech strategy essentially. So that's where you might hit a stumbling block. But it's understanding the chain, the different stakeholders, what is important to them, and just making sure you're kind of ticking those boxes to make sure they get what they need.
Yeah.
But from a product development point of view, you've always got to be moving forward. This is tech, so it's using the latest technology to just make sure that the underlying goal of that individual is always the most effective that it could be.
It's interesting that you also then have those interviews as well, because I think sometimes you can look at the data and we don't necessarily know that we have these biases.
Yeah.
And, it's confirmation biases, and you look at the data, you think, okay, well that's because we're doing this, and that that's why that customer's not using this properly, is because they're doing X, Y, Z. But actually, it's not until you speak to them, it might be another reason.
Exactly.
And I think it's understanding those biases that we have as well. It's really important. Just back to the psychology, I guess. But this unconscious bias that we have.
Definitely. So we obviously kind of analyse the database to kind of drive our product development, but a lot of the feedback we get is exactly that. They're asking for certain features or specific solutions, but actually if you go and speak to them and you kind of dig beneath the surface and keep asking why they want this and what are they trying to achieve, you get to the underlying reason, which is actually they didn't want the button to be blue, which is what they suggested in their feedback. They actually wanted, the visitor to be signed in quicker, and actually that was the end goal. And so it's kind of it's getting beneath the surface to what that person is trying to achieve. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because it's true. You can ask people what they want, or you can take on board their feedback, and even sometimes there's a little bit more to it.
Yeah.
People don't always necessarily know what they want until you actually either dig a bit deeper or you give them something and just trial things.
Yeah.
And actually then you sort of understand it a bit more.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting space.
Yeah, definitely. And we pilot as well as part of our kind of release process. So if we built a new proposition, new solution, rather than just releasing it, we'll take it out to a bunch of kind of quite engaged stakeholders, trial it with them for a period of time, get their direct feedback on it, because sometimes you can have a great idea, you put it into practice and it doesn't work quite as you expected, or what they suggested in the initial validation is different in practice, and so you can fine tune and shape it before it goes out.
Interesting. I think it's that startup approach that these larger real estate companies need to take as well, because you're doing that from a product development perspective, but they also need to do that to understand how their employees are using the product or the solution, and maybe what some of the challenges might be there.
It's a mindset change, I think, because you almost need to be comfortable with imperfection. So rather than trying to over-spec something to the point of perfection, which just frankly isn't really possible, kind of design something, get it out the door, see how people behave when they're using it, see what reception it gets, and then evolve it and kind of iterate and improve from there based on the data that you're receiving.
That's a cultural thing, I think,
it
as
is,
well.
Yeah.
That's where the company culture comes in. I think the younger generation are a bit better at that as well. They're sort of, used to using social media and things and building up their own, I guess, personal brand often, and just giving things a go and seeing what happens. Whereas I think the older sort of generation, certainly my generation as well, are not used to experimenting, not used to failing. I think
it's a more rigid approach, isn't it?
It is, yeah. You can't afford to get things wrong, and actually, if you just thought, if you set the expectation at the start to say, well, this isn't going to be right straight away.
Exactly.
We're going to have to trial this and then change things as we go along, and then have processes in place to actually make those changes as well, then, I think we would all sort of be a bit more comfortable with change and innovation.
Rather than setting out for perfection, just improving on where you were yesterday and keeping that journey going. Yeah. I think from our experience as well, we found, you mentioned kind of the younger generation and consumers, I think that has been a big driver for change within the real estate organisations, especially in our field, because the expectation nowadays is everything is instant, everything is very convenient, everything is just available at the tap of a button, essentially. So, you'll order your Deliveroo, you'll book your cinema tickets on your phone via an app. Why wouldn't you be able to access your building via an app? Why wouldn't you be able to see who's around you, access your services via the same method? So that, I think, has been a huge driver, because the expectation among the younger generations is this should just be available to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a bit of a sea change in mindset of the larger organisations that they're having to adjust to.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's a big sort of war for talent at the moment, and the younger talented people, if they're not in an environment where they can do things how they would expect to do them and be able to drive change, they'll go to a smaller organisation or to a startup who's used to that. And I think we're starting to see that actually from even those that have studied real estate that would traditionally go down a graduate career path, or go onto a graduate scheme and work for sort of Knight Frank or JLL. They are now thinking about taking that knowledge that they've acquired through their degree and going into a prop tech startup, or they will go onto the graduate scheme and then they'll go to a prop tech startup. So, and a lot of that comes out of the frustration, I think, because of how things are so slow, and they want to be able to do things instantaneously, like you said, and drive real change. And now we're seeing the universities as well talk more about prop tech, whereas I think when UKPA first launched, there was no sort of conversation with universities at that stage. It was all sort of in industry. When you start working, the first time young real estate graduates would find out about prop tech was when they went to a conference. Whereas now, I've been invited to Reading University to come and talk to the students there about prop tech, and they're doing that on an annual basis, and other universities are doing that as well. And so that's how I think it will start to drive that, from the education all the way through to industry. Yeah,
exactly. We have kind of been involved in a program at Saïd Business School in Oxford as well, just presenting to the students, showing them about the organisation, what's possible, kind of getting their ideas on roadmap, inspiration. So it's definitely kind of becoming more of a norm, I guess, within the sector.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess at UKPA, you're kind of the bridge between startups and large real estate organisations. So we talked about how startups can effectively kind of approach the large players. How can the real estate organisations more effectively work with the startups?
I think it's just being open to engaging with them and sharing more about what it is that they're trying to achieve. And they are starting to do that. I think you've got the heads of innovation and directors of innovation that really do want to start engaging with prop techs, and at UKPA we've just started an initiative around office hours with an innovation lead. So the idea is that someone like James Pella or Nikash, who both sit on our board, they can give up some of their time once a month or so, hear from startups that want to better understand how to approach companies like that they represent, but also it gives them an opportunity to sort of share what they're working on as well, because although I think they do sort of know who the key players are in the industry, I think actually being able to share what some of those challenges might be with the implementation, or just sort of share where their key priorities areas are, which I think have shifted quite a lot over the last year or so, with the economic sort of climate and with climate change as well. All of that has shifted what they're focusing on. So, being open to coming along to the events that we run and being participating in the office hours and just, engaging in a non-salesy environment. Because I think often the resistance has been, if we come to an event where there's lots of prop techs, then we're going to get sold to. And, that's not what we try and do at all at UKPA. We have the roundtable events, we have the office hours, and it's much more of a way to sort of address market trends, address those barriers that we talked about in a close-knit forum. And I think that's what we need to be doing a little bit more of, and doing a deeper dive into it. Yeah,
having an open and honest conversation between those parties rather than kind of selling at each other, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And these organisations still, have to get that internal buy-in as well. So you've got James and Nikash, who are there, tasked with looking at innovation and how it can help with the business needs, and then they have to then go and influence internally as well. So I think the real estate industry is also, other people within those organisations need to get involved as well, and come along and sort of try and understand more about how technology can impact what they're doing.
So breaking it out of just the innovation space and actually kind of opening it up to the wider company.
Yeah, because I think otherwise it's just we stay in this sort of bubble.
It's an add-on, isn't it?
It's just, and you're almost then preaching to the converted. You know, it's the rest of the business and understanding what their needs are and the motivators and the drivers and the barriers like we talked about.
Yeah, and can the innovation lead be the middleman to kind of champion that internally in the organisation?
Yeah, I think so, but I think they also want to have, you know, forums and environments where their colleagues can come along. So, you know, that's, you know, what we're trying to do at UKPA as well, is broaden that out so that it's not just on their shoulders to have to drive that change or do the influencing. Although I think as I said, you know, so I'm also part of the BPF Tech and Innovation Working Group, which is made up of all these people responsible for innovation. And there's lots of companies that are represented there that have those sessions internally to understand technology, and they will, you know, there's actually a lot more buy-in than I think they even expected. There was, you know, in the last meeting that we had, there was one person that was sort of saying that he just expected the younger generation to be the ones that were interested in what he was presenting, and actually it was lots of people within the organisation at all different ages, all different levels, wanted to understand. So I think the willingness is there now, and those attitudes towards technology are changing. The conversation is now, I think, less why should we change and more how does this make my life easier? How can we implement this in a easier way, in a more effective way?
And do you feel that there are kind of inherent biases that those organisations should be aware of that they might need to overcome through that implementation?
What do you mean by biases?
I guess it's kind of driving back to your kind of underlying psychology of change management within those organisations. So it sounds like it's being championed internally. There's an appetite for it, but sometimes it still moves fairly slowly. So why is that?
So I think with some companies there may be a bias in terms of only engaging with companies that they've heard of or are maybe slightly more established. There's, you know, obviously perceived risks that if it's a younger company, they may not be around for very long, or they may not have got enough market traction, and it comes down to that, you know, the early majority versus the early adopters and the innovators. If they're in that category of the majority, they don't necessarily want to be working with companies that no one else is working with yet. So there may be that sort of bias there. But I think, I would say that there's attitudes towards technology are changing. I think that's less of a problem. When it comes down to the implementation and it being so slow, I think that comes down to the lack of communication between the two sides. When I speak to some of our prop tech members, you know, they will say that it can take about 18 months just to sign a contract. Why is that? I mean, are they set up in the right way, or is it just not a priority? I think all of that still has to be uncovered. And so we really want to look into that a bit more this year and give, provide that forum to say, okay, well, if it is taking 18 months, is there something that the prop techs need to do to be better prepared? There's lots of conversation actually about cybersecurity that I'm hearing in, you know, those circles with the innovation leads. I don't know how much that is coming up in circles with the prop techs. You know, should they be looking at how they can, make it clear that they are that the technology that they have is protected and has all that the safety that they need. You know, could they be putting that into their contracts? I think the other issue that is raised on the property side is that they need to make sure the technology solutions they're bringing in can be integrated with either the other solutions that they're also looking at or existing solutions. And so some, the conversations I've had is that they're thinking, well, maybe they should put that into the contracts that they've got, so that, it's compulsory that they have to be able to integrate.
Which makes sense, but then you're putting a lot of pressure on the startups to kind of promise certain integrations that they might not be geared up to deliver. And you're also putting more pressure on the contract process itself when elongating that. So it's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is, I think there's probably a mismatch of expectations there that needs to somehow balance out.
Yeah.
Because you can't put it all on the prop techs who are just trying to get the product ready. They're trying to hire the right people. They're trying to sell to these companies, and they need that sort of opportunity to build the business. But on the other hand, you can't just put it on the property companies who obviously, have the legacy issues, they have processes in place.
Yeah.
That's where I think maybe there needs to be a completely different way of operating. Really needs to, I think we need to look at the organisational design. Mm-hmm. Is the property industry geared up to be able to work with startups? Because they could be missing out on opportunities just because they can only they're only able to work with the larger companies that have more of a runway because it takes 18 months.
Yeah.
Not every prop tech company can afford to wait 18 months, but they're missing out on these opportunities to work with really great companies and bring in really great solutions.
Absolutely, and potentially putting less pressure on those individual deals, so being more willing to experiment and try out ideas and, as you say, kind of iterate. If that fails, move on, try different providers, like A/B test different buildings or solutions, see which works best for them, as opposed to just hitting a stalemate and kind of not making a decision, essentially.
Yes, yeah, agreed. I think, though, that we are starting to see companies willing to pilot, and that process doesn't seem to take as long, But it's then, how do you move from pilot to actually, full implementation? That bit, there still seems to be a real sort of gap.
Yeah, I think that goes back to kind of the tech adoption curve, but within that organisation itself. So the piloting sites are the early adopters in that instance. How do you then break that gap or kind of jump the chasm into the early majority?
Yeah.
Goes back down to the value and internal kind of, not appetite, but ability to roll it out, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, that's where the change management, looking at people, processes, technology, all of it together comes in.
Well, fantastic having a chat with you today, Sammy. Thank you very much for coming on with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.